I started getting into this rabbit hole of a retro PC hobby about 6 or 7 years ago now when my brother in law gave me a couple of old systems. One of them was this 486 that I restored, from the era that really got me excited about computers back in the day. It's a really nice low profile DEC PC system from Digital, and even has a DX266 overdrive in it, just like my first 486 system back in 1994. But after getting it all set up for some DOS gaming, I was left quite underwhelmed. Gaming experience with 3D titles like Doom was really nothing like I remembered back in the day. It was just very choppy and really not a lot of fun to play. Released in 1992, this DEC LPX system has ISA slots only, and the onboard graphics chipset, an S3P86C924, is also connected to the ISA bus. Didn't know much about hardware back in the day, but I very clearly remember my best friend's dad, who was a real computer wizard, telling us to make sure we got a VESA Local Bus system. May not have understood what that really meant for 3D gaming back in 1994, but today I certainly do. Even in the early to mid-90s, the 16-bit ISA bus was already very old. It was originally developed for the 286-powered IBM PC-AT all the way back in the mid-80s. With a 16-bit bus width and a clock speed of only 8 MHz, that is not a lot of bit pushing capability. By the time 486s became mainstream, the aging ISA bus was becoming a very serious bottleneck, especially for the ever-improving VGA chipsets becoming available, not to mention the much faster hard drives too. Early on, there were some VGA chipsets that performed pretty badly in gaming, like the Trident 8900C for example, and you'd find a pretty huge gap between what was considered a slow ISA card and a fast one. But if you look at the top 3 examples on this chart here, some of the fastest ISA cards, there really isn't that much of a difference anymore. That slow ISA bus has completely held these cards back from their full potential. Although there were some faster promising bus alternatives out there like IBM's microchannel and the ESA or extended ISA bus, they never really caught on in the mainstream for various reasons. It wasn't until VESA Local Bus came onto the scene, and PCI not long after, that severe bottleneck was finally lifted, and massive gains in video card performance could finally be had. In other words, Doom finally played smoothly. If you were stuck with an ISA-only system back then, there were a few ways you could squeeze a bit more out of it. Once the VGA card saturated the bus, it wasn't long before people realized that running the bus a bit out of spec, say 10 or 11 MHz instead of 8, could get you some substantial performance gains. I can't say I've ever tried this before, but I've always been very curious to see just how much of a performance gain can be had, and to see how far the ISA bus can be pushed when it comes to graphics. So when I heard about CPU Galaxy's upcoming ISA Doom 25 FPS challenge, I was immediately intrigued. If you haven't checked out CPU Galaxy's YouTube channel, definitely head over there. He's got some awesome retro content and an absolutely incredible collection of CPUs and hardware. He's also quite famous for pushing 486 systems to their limits, and I'll include a link in the description below. So as the name of the challenge implies, the goal is to get at least 25 frames per second in Doom using an ISA graphics card, which may not sound like a lot, but can be quite challenging. The official rules and announcement may not be out at the time this video goes live, so keep an eye on the CPU Galaxy channel and the hashtag for that. But the rules are pretty simple really. First, you have to use an ISA graphics card, obviously. But when it comes to motherboards, ISA-only motherboards are preferred, but you can also use a combo VLB ISA board, which was an exception made to increase the variety of boards to choose from for the challenge. Anything newer with PCI slots is prohibited, so even some of the newer PCI 486 boards that are well known for overclocking are going to be out. The CPU is pretty much up to you, as long as it can operate within the confines of the other restrictions. So a 386 all the way up to a Pentium overdrive would all be fine. Doom must be run in high quality graphics mode with the viewable area expanded all the way to the HUD. Phil's DOS benchmark pack is the easiest way to do this, and it'll run through the correct demo file for you and provide a realtic score that can be converted to frames per second, and I'll include the formula for that in the description below. So today, we'll be stretching that ISA bus to the max, and we'll see just how quick we can get 3D games like Doom to run. On most systems, the ISA bus timing of 8 MHz is derived by dividing the front-side bus frequency. Because there are 486 CPUs out there with bus frequencies ranging anywhere from 16 to 50 MHz, there's quite a few dividers available for use. So for example, with a common 33 MHz front-side bus, a 1/4 divider is used to provide 8.25 MHz for the ISA bus. If you're running a slower 25 MHz CPU, you'd need a 1/3 divider, and so on. Some systems also have a dedicated 14.38 MHz crystal that's used for timing, and they can use a 1/2 divider with it to provide a decoupled 7.19 megahertz ISA bus frequency. So it can vary a little, but generally it stays pretty close to 8 megahertz. But as you've probably already guessed, there's really nothing stopping you from selecting a quote-unquote wrong divider, effectively overclocking the ISA bus. So if I was to use the 1/3 divider with a 33 megahertz frontside bus, I'd be forcing it to run at 11 megahertz instead of 8.25. But as you can imagine, running the ISA bus out of spec is not going to be tolerated by a lot of expansion cards out there. Small increases are usually fine, but start pushing it too far and you're bound to run into problems. So for testing, I'll be using the MSI MS4138, a SYS85C471 based VLB motherboard. Doesn't really look like anything too remarkable. It's a 5-volt only board, doesn't have onboard I/O, but it is one of my favorite VLB boards. I find it to be very stable, compatibility is great, and it takes a coin cell battery too, which is always nice. It's got some pretty good tweakability too. Right back L1 cache actually works, and it even takes up to 512 kilobytes of L2 cache, which I have installed here. For RAM, I'm going to be using a single stick of 60 nanosecond fast page memory. This is 8 megabytes, but really that's all I need for these tests today. For a CPU, I'm going to use an Evergreen upgrade processor based on the AMD AM5X86. Since this board doesn't support 3-volt chips, this one will be perfect for it. I really wanted to use an AM5X86 because it's a very flexible CPU that can be configured to run with a 3x or 4x multiplier, and can run stable at both 40 and 50 megahertz frontside bus frequencies. And obviously having the fastest 486 possible will help to eliminate any CPU bottlenecks, and it'll give us a better idea of how the ISA bus speed impacts VGA performance. For storage, I'm going to be using a Winbond VESA Local Bus I/O card instead of an ISA one, which should help with stability as the ISA bus speed gets really out of spec. Now, some of the I/O on this thing is going to be connected to the ISA bus, including serial ports, parallel, game port, but that's okay, I don't really need them. I will be doing some testing with an ISA I/O card afterward though. For graphics cards, I've got a few ISA models to choose from, but the one I've settled on that's both fast and very stable is this one here, the ATI Mach 32. So this chipset wasn't really known as the fastest or most compatible for later VLB and PCI-based systems, but it is a very capable chipset. It can really push those pixels on the older ISA bus. I also have this Diamond Speedstar here, based on the famous Tseng Labs ET4000. So this is one of the fastest ISA chipsets out there. But sadly, this older revision card has some quirks and it's just refusing to cooperate with me, despite some promising results earlier, so I'll have to save this one for another day. Other cards, although really fast, like the Cirrus Logic GD5422, were only ever intended for use on the ISA bus, so they were not designed with higher interface frequencies in mind, and they start glitching out pretty badly once the ISA bus speed is increased. So before I get started, I just wanted to thank Chas Linux, who is the project leader for the Community Computer Recycling Center in Kitchener, Ontario. He gave me this ATI Mach 32 card several years back, along with a whole bunch of other stuff over the years that's really come in handy. And I also wanted to thank Lee from Nova Scotia in Canada. He sent me both the MS4138 and the Evergreen upgrade chip that I'm using in this video today, so thanks again. So for testing, I started with the AM5X86 at its default frontside bus frequency of 33 megahertz. I went ahead and set the ISA divider to 1/3 for an 11 megahertz clock, but to my surprise, the benchmark results were completely unchanged from 8 megahertz, made no difference at all, which was a bit concerning. Time to break out the oscilloscope. So the ISA pinout has a particular pin reserved for clock purposes. It'll be 12 pins from the left of the keyed position on the bottom row. So during system post, I can see that the default of around 8.33 megahertz is applied, which is a frontside bus frequency divider. And then once post is completed, it seems to drop down to 7.18 megahertz. The ISA bus divider set in the BIOS seems to have no effect here at all, and the system is instead using the 14.38 megahertz crystal that's divided by half. So the 7.18 megahertz option is selectable in the BIOS, but for whatever reason, it continually wants to fall back to it. I wasted a fair bit of time troubleshooting this, but just couldn't figure it out and chalked it up to a BIOS bug of some sort. But thankfully, the retro webpage for this board included a newer award-based beta release. It was certainly worth a shot, and as an added bonus, this version of Award removes the annoying 500 megabyte hard drive size limitation. Since I was going to go to the trouble of flashing this, I decided to open the BIOS file up in Modbin to see if there were any hidden options that I could unlock. Most of them were already there, but there's a few including slow refresh that were hidden. Enabling slow refresh should definitely have a positive performance benefit. The 28-pin dip chip for this board's BIOS is not an EEPROM, but a UV erasable PROM chip. And that means that it's not possible to update the BIOS using a software flashing utility. Gonna need to use my external programmer instead. But rather than messing with the existing chip, I'm just gonna use a compatible one that I have here as a spare. Into the UV tanning bed you go. I got this purpose-specific UV EEPROM eraser last year, and it's really worth the money if you ever have to do this. Trying to build one or do this with sunlight can be a very frustrating experience. There is a very specific wavelength of UV required, and not all lamps will have the desired effect. In my experience, about 20 or 30 minutes in here is all that's needed, but you should always check the datasheet of your chip just to be sure. Also, don't forget to cover the UV window on the chip before programming it. Looks like Geek & Spiel stickers are the perfect size for this. The programmer I use is the TL866-2. Very handy tool to have for anyone working a lot with older systems, and it can do a lot more than just program EEPROM chips too. It can be used to test SRAM and all sorts of other ICs. As time goes on, I keep discovering other things that it's capable of. It's not the cheapest programmer out there, but I'd highly recommend it if you're looking for one. So it looks like the system is posting just fine, and in the chipset settings I can now see my hidden options revealed on the right hand side. But first, let's get that ISA divider set for 11 MHz again and see if it holds this time. With the new award BIOS, the ISA bus clock appears to be set for a 1/4 divider during the post process, giving us a 6.6 MHz clock speed. Let's see if it increases to 11 MHz once the post completes. Aha, yes it does. We're showing a solid 11 MHz in DOS now, so I think we've overcome that critical hurdle, and we can begin to do some tweaking and benchmarking. Running 3D Bench 1.0C with the ISA bus at 11 MHz and the CPU at the default clock and frontside bus gives us a score of 41.7 frames per second, up from 35.1. That's almost 20% higher than with the ISA bus at 8 MHz. And Doom does even better with 3,410 real ticks or 21.9 frames per second. Really encouraging results so far, but we are really just getting warmed up here. There's still a lot more potential in this system. I haven't even overclocked the front side bus or CPU yet, and we've got quite a few ISA dividers to try. If I really want to be able to push the ISA bus to the max, I'm going to need to get this system running at a higher front side bus. At a 33 MHz bus speed, the highest you can do with the ISA bus is 16 MHz. At 40, it'll be 20 MHz, and at 50 MHz, it'll be a blistering 25. I reduced the AM5X86's multiplier to 3x, and I was able to get a 50 MHz frontside bus working just fine, and that's with a 150 MHz CPU clock. I was also able to keep the memory timings and wait states to the lowest values possible, and really the only thing I had to loosen up a bit was the cache read state to 2T. I had no problems at all at 10 MHz and saw some small performance gains, so went ahead and took it further to 12.5 MHz, and this is a 50% overclock of the ISA bus. And boom, 25.1 frames per second in Doom. Pretty incredible. But there are still 2 more dividers to go, both 1/3 and 1/2. Let's see if this card can take it. I gotta admit, I was a little nervous setting the 1/3 divider here. A 100% overclock of the ISA bus is really starting to push it. But wow, at 16.67 MHz, things are just really beginning to shine. No graphical anomalies at all, and a little over 2,400 real ticks or 30.4 frames per second in Doom, which is just amazing. But could this system possibly have more in it? Can it possibly handle the 1/2 divider for an incredible 25 MHz or a 212% overclock of the ISA bus? Spicy. I honestly wasn't sure what would happen at 25 MHz, but amazingly, everything's working beautifully. 3D Bench 1.0C is running at a speed that would put many VLB systems to shame here, scoring an impressive 65.3 frames per second, which is just amazing with an ISA graphics card. But the real question, of course, is can it handle Doom? And it can indeed. Wow, just incredibly smooth for an ISA graphics card, that's for sure. Don't see any artifacting at all, or anything unusual really. But having such a fast 46 and a well-tuned system obviously makes a big difference here too. Once that ISA bottleneck is opened up, the rest of the system just really has an opportunity to stretch its legs. But yeah, still going. No problems yet. And yes, it did it. 2,090 real ticks, and if my math is correct, that's 35.7 frames per second, which is just amazing. Here's a chart with all the results on the overclocked system. As you can see, things really continue to scale really well as the ISA bus frequency increases. The only oddity that I really see here is the 10 megahertz result. It doesn't seem to provide much of a boost over 8.3 for some reason, but once you get past 12.5 megahertz, the difference is significant. You may have noticed that I ran the Doom benchmark with the screen expanded all the way, but with the HUD still visible at the bottom of the screen. This is the way the vast majority of people play Doom, so I configured it this way. But the default used by Phil's DOS benchmark pack is a complete full screen mode that's a little bit more demanding on the system. I wanted to include the results for this mode as well, just for good measure and to make the results comparable for others who may have run it this way. But as you can see, there isn't that much of a difference between the two views, almost exactly 1 frame per second in every test I did. And in 3D Bench 1.0c, we can see a very similar trend. With the ISA bus at 25 megahertz, we achieved a very impressive 65.3 frames per second. That's an increase of 54% over the 8 megahertz result. Not as much of an improvement compared to Doom, which was about 70%, but still a huge boost, that's for sure. I'm pretty lucky that I was able to use a VLB IDE card here, and there's no doubt that it helped me to achieve those results. But what if this was a pure ISA-based system and I didn't have that luxury? In reality, if someone had this board back in the day, around 1994 or so, they'd probably be taking advantage of a VLB graphics card. It was an interesting experiment, but I can't help but feel that it's cheating just a little. So I'm going to swap out the VLB IDE card for an ISA-based one and see if I can get anywhere near the results that I saw previously. Sadly, all 3 of my ISA I/O cards just flat out refuse to work at 25 megahertz, and the system just won't boot from the compact flash card. But this Acer M5105 based card seems to be the most stable of them all. It'll work well at 16.6 megahertz and even 20, but just barely. Fine for some benchmarks, but not really what I'd consider stable. Whether or not it'll corrupt my compact flash card, we'll have to see. But I've got an interesting problem. I can't run a 20 megahertz ISA bus clock with a 50 megahertz frontside bus. I'll need to drop it down to 40 and use the 1/2 divider. But on a positive note, I can put the CPU multiplier back up to 4x for a slightly higher 160 megahertz CPU clock. So the big question will be, what's faster, a 50 megahertz frontside bus and 16.6 megahertz ISA clock, or a 40 megahertz frontside bus and a 20 megahertz ISA clock? I didn't have any major problems in either of these configurations, but the Evergreen upgrade processor does seem to be just slightly unstable at 160 megahertz, probably due to the tiny voltage regulator that's on it. But when you combine that with a borderline I/O card at 20 megahertz ISA, it makes for a little bit of a flaky system. It does okay with benchmarks, but you can't really play a game for longer than a few minutes before it crashes out. And amazingly, they are very close. There's almost no difference at all. The higher CPU clock and higher ISA bus clock seem to win out just very slightly over the faster memory and cache of the 50 megahertz configuration. But wow, 30.5 frames per second. Really impressive for a pure ISA-based 486 system. So running Doom benchmarks is great and all, but just how useless is the ISA bus at 20 or 25 megahertz? Does anything else work at all? I tried a few things, and surprisingly, not everything had a problem. My serial mouse worked just fine despite the I/O controller being on the ISA bus, and I tried a couple of sound cards too. One of them didn't work at all, but this Sound Blaster CT2800 kinda, sorta, sometimes works. But yeah, you can tell things really don't sound right. There's distortion and other weird timing problems. But when I backed it off to a 1/3 divider for a 16.6 megahertz clock, it was actually a lot better. Not perfect though. I also tried a couple of network cards, but sadly none of them would work at 25 megahertz. My 3Com Etherlink 3 would initialize okay, but it would just hang up the system when I tried to use it. Once again, dropping it down to 16.6 megahertz seemed to bring it back to life. So yeah, practically speaking, I'd say it's a pretty terrible idea to run the ISA bus that far out of spec, but it was still a fun challenge and experiment nonetheless. But there were definitely some folks out there that took advantage of ISA bus overclocking back in the day, pushing things just a little to 11 megahertz or so for a boost in performance. As I showed earlier, this alone could get you over 20% better frame rates, and frequencies like that were much more realistic for the vast majority of ISA cards and for 24/7 use. So there you have it. Smooth gameplay is indeed possible with Doom and an ISA graphics card hitting a mind-boggling 35.7 frames per second at a blistering 25 MHz ISA bus frequency, over 200% out of spec. Combine a really well-tuned board with a fast 46, fast memory, and you've got yourself a winning combination. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see some more retro PC content like this. And as always, be sure to check the video description below for links and other useful information. Thanks again.